Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 11 on persuasive speaking in the textbook Communication in the Real World. So glad you're here to learn about persuasive speaking, right? It's an interesting topic. We receive a lot of messages, especially through the media, through advertising, that are persuasive in nature. And so while this chapter, focuses specifically on public speaking, some of those same principles also get used in a variety of other aspects of our life. So again, think marketing, advertising, even our interpersonal conversations, we're persuading each other. Sometimes, hey, you want to go out here to eat? What do you want to do after dinner? Right? Hey, you want to go out to this concert with me? Right? Those are persuasive messages, and some of the principles in terms of public speaking can also apply to those other situations. But with public speaking, often you'll have a longer time where it's one person talking at an audience. That person's going to have the microphone, right? They're going to have be leading the conversation, and you'll get some feedback from the audience, certainly, but oftentimes you have a prepared message that you're sending, and you're going to want to keep the audience in mind when you're creating that message and seeing what works well for them. So this first aspect talks about the foundations of persuasion. So persuasive speaking seeks to influence the beliefs, attitudes, values, or behaviors of audience members. And you want to use arguments that appeal to the audience. So just because something appeals to you doesn't mean it appeals to your audience. So you may need to edit things with the audience in mind to make it work for them. So some key definitions here. First, a claim. A claim is a statement that will be supported by evidence. Evidence, also called the grounds, supports the claim. A claim, you'll have your overarching thesis for your speech. Then you'll have some main points as well, which are your claims. So you might have three main points for your persuasive speech. Those are different claims that you're making. You're going to support with evidence. So that's more of the research that you're doing, the grounds to support those claims. So saying, hey, I really like, the color blue is calming for people. That might be my claim. But what evidence supports that? Okay, I'm going to cite the research that says the color blue is calming for people. Here's a little bit more about the research. Here's where I found that information, right? So that's the evidence. You have the claim and then the evidence. Next, the warrant is the underlying justification that connects the claim and the evidence. So one warrant for a claim and evidence cited. All right, let me back up a little bit to the example. So a speaker may make the following claim: there should be a national law against texting while driving. Again, persuasive message, very persuasive. You should have a national law against texting while driving. The evidence says research from the U.S. Department of Transportation found that texting while driving creates a crash risk, right? It's 23 times worse than driving while not distracted, so much worse. That's very specific evidence that you found that supports the claim. And then the warrant, that the U.S. Department of Transportation is an institute that creates research with credible experts. So again, really connected to that topic. You may have evidence that is completely unrelated to the claim, right? That could be a logical fallacy, which again, then you don't have a warrant. So you may have evidence. You may have the statistic here against texting while driving is bad, and then your claim is, well, the color blue is calming for people. Those two things don't fit together, right? This evidence has nothing to do with the claim. Now, that's a very obvious example where the claim and evidence are far apart, but sometimes speakers will use evidence that is similar to the claim. But again, it's not connected because the warrant is not there. And so again, you want to be thoughtful, because if you have those logical fallacies, or you're lacking the warrant or don't have evidence and you just have claims, again, your audience is not necessarily going to be going along with you. You may believe it very wholeheartedly. You may have other information that that you're not sharing, that you weren't able to fit into your speech. But then the audience isn't going to take that in, and they may not believe you. They may not view you as credible. So you want to make sure you have solid evidence to support your claims, and that there's a warrant connecting that evidence to the claim. So 11.2 here is adapting persuasive messages. So again, think about your audience throughout the speech making process. If you give a speech to different audiences, right? If you give the same speech, you're going to need to edit it. So for example, I give speeches in rural Minnesota sometimes about how we can create an inclusive environment where everyone feels welcome. So often I'll talk about things like we need to avoid canceling people for saying the wrong thing. We need to create, a welcoming environment. I'll tell some stories of how I helped create change and how people think about things differently. So lots of stories and examples. But I'll also use data that's specific to that region. So I gave it a Redwood Falls, so I looked more in Southwest Minnesota. What are some of the demographics like in this region? I went to International Falls, way northern Minnesota, so I brought different data to them, right? I adapted it to that audience. I gave one, it was an online speech, the same topic. It was to both Minnesota and Iowa, so I had to pick up some information from Iowa. And then they also had people both in rural Minnesota and in more urban areas like the Twin Cities, Des Moines. And for me, I normally talk to rural audiences, so my target audience is rural. My message is very rural, and I'm just like, oh, how do I, adapt my message to a more urban audience in bigger cities, because they have different ways of looking at inclusion than we do in rural areas. And I really think about rural inclusion and how we love our small towns, we love our communities, we're passionate about helping your neighbors and being a part of people. But if you're in a bigger city, you may not always know your neighbors. You may be more about the hustle and bustle. So again, it's a different message. And how do I keep both of those audiences in mind when giving the same speech? So that could be a difficulty if you have a lot of diversity in your audience. It's like I need to keep multiple audiences in mind. So I had to think of ways to not necessarily everything was going to fit both audiences, but I needed stuff for both sets of audiences. So if we're looking at persuasive message, how am I going to persuade one audience? How am I going to persuade my second main audience? So again, adapting the message to fit with more people. It gives an example here. If you have audience members who already agree with your proposition, you should focus on intensifying that agreement. And you also can assume they have some foundational knowledge of the topic. So again, that's what you're working on. But if you're giving a speech to your audience and they don't know about your proposition, they don't know about what you're persuading them, you're going to do a lot more informing, right? That's where it may sound a lot like an informative speech, but you may have a persuasive message at the end. But again, if you need to inform the audience on some basics of your topic, that's maybe where they're at. And that's where you should start. You should always have a call to action within a persuasive speech, and they should be as specific as possible to capitalize on your audience members' motivations in the moment, so they're more likely to follow through on that action. So if you're giving a speech online, like over Zoom, you may drop a link in the chat and saying, hey, if you want to follow up with more information, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media. Right, let me give you a link to make it super easy for you. I've seen presentations where I do a lot of nonprofit stuff. I like nonprofits and fundraising, so they'll drop a link. Oh, donate today. Here's how you donate. Fill out this form to get more information. So certainly you want to grab that audience's attention right away. Some of your persuasive messages may have bigger asks for the audience, for them to think differently about something, for them to take a larger action that they can't do right there in the moment. And so that's why you need to make sure your message is memorable and that motivation kind of sticks with them over time. So the example earlier about texting and driving, hopefully they're not driving while listening to your speech, right? So how do we make them get away from technology when they get in their car next and stay away from texting while driving and stay away from those distractions? How do you keep it with them? So your call to action should be very specific. Next time you get in the car, remember the speech and put that phone down. Right. So again, being very specific. And once you get them to start a new pattern where they aren't using their phone while driving, it's easier to change. Audience members can also be neutral on the topic because they're uninformed about it or they don't think it affects them. Certainly, those are different audiences. So you may need to one, inform them on the topic, or two, figure out how the topic connects to them. I always tell my students when they're picking a speech topic, pick something that you're passionate about. And with the persuasive speech, it's like, well, what if my audience isn't passionate about it? Get them passionate. Share about why you started caring about the topic, what got you first involved, and that may lead you to where your audience may want to get involved or how they may connect themselves to the topic. So that can be very important as well. So 11.3 here is determining your proposition. So the proposition of your speech is the overall direction of the content and how that content relates to the speech goal. Persuasive speech will primarily fall into one of three categories. One, a proposition of fact. Two, a proposition of value. Three, a proposition of policy. A fact, so increased greenhouse gases relate to human activity cause global warming. You're going to be persuading them that that fact is true. Now, it's really something that has been debated, but you're going to have evidence to prove it true. You could take the opposite position and find evidence to prove it false. But your end goal is for your audience to agree with that fact. Now, certainly you're going to ask them to do something with that fact, not just, oh, now you should agree with me because I'm right. Okay, well, maybe you're trying to persuade them to view the topic differently. But then what do you want them to do now that they know that fact, right? So that's something to think about. The second one, proposition of value. America's disproportionately large amount of pollution relative to other countries is wrong. So value is often about what's right and what's wrong. So it's about morals, values, beliefs. And you may need to know, right, or try and figure out the morals, values, beliefs of your audience in order to convince them, persuade them on a proposition of value for them to view a topic differently, or tap in, why does your values fit with the values of this specific topic? How can I get you to care about this or be concerned about it? The third one, in proposition of policy, there should be stricter emission restrictions on individual cars. So again, you want something changed often at the government level. It can be the local government. It can be, your college. That can be a policy, a college policy. This college policy needs to be changed. Certainly, you can do that. Government, federal government policy. Here's contact your Congress person. Contact your senator to get this changed. So certainly, that can be a policy. So it can be facts, values, or policy to fit into it. Again, if you're not exactly sure where it fits, that's okay for the purposes of kind of introduction to communication class. But as you start moving forward, if you continue taking communication classes, you're going to, especially in terms of persuasive speaking and rhetoric, you're going to want to think about that more and understand those differences. And if you do like speech and debate too, they're very concerned with those nuances. So 11.4 is on organizing a persuasive speech. So there's certainly another chapter talked about several patterns for organizing your speech, but some persuasive speaking topics fit better with different patterns. So really your topic here is going to create a lot of difference. So I like recommending the problem solution as an easy organizational patterns. Here's the problem, here's how I'm going to solve it. We also do the problem cause solution. Here's a problem, here's what causes the problem, and here's how my solution is going to fix it. So that seems to be a pretty easy way of taking the kind of a just standard way of using a persuasive speech, but not all topics are going to work best for that, or maybe you want to approach it differently. So the second one that talks about is the cause-effect pattern. Can be used for informative speaking when the relationship between the cause and effect is not contested. It's fitting for persuasive speeches when it's, hold on, it's not contested. The relationship. These two sentences seem to contradict each other a little bit. But anyway, you're going to be talking about the causes and the effects. So here's the causes, here's what happens, here's the effect. It's a 2-point structure. You could also have like cause, effect, or cause, effect. So it doesn't necessarily just need to be those 2 points. But again, it has to be around the same general topic, and they should be related and connected to each other in that persuasive speech. And then there's also some other formats that could work, like problem solution, problem failed solution, proposed solution. So we tried something before, it didn't work. Here's why my new idea is better. So again, that's looking at multiple sides of the issue. So that's why I like that one. Cause effect, cause effect, cause effect effect, cause effect solution. So lots of ways to mix and match for these persuasive speaking topics. But again, it's to be thoughtful about how everything's connected together. There's also Monroe's motivated sequence. It's an organizational pattern designed for persuasive speaking that appeals to an audience member's needs and motivates them to action. Often we see this like in infomercials. So again, a lot of persuasive speaking can be seen in advertising and marketing. But again, Monroe's motivated sequence has 5 steps. So the first one is attention. With any speech, you should have an attention getter, something to grab them in. So that's pretty standard. The second step for Monroe's motivated sequence is need. You're going to cite evidence to support the fact that there is a need that needs to be addressed, right? The audience has a need. You're hungry and you need to eat, right? That is your need. Satisfaction. So the solution, kind of like problem solution, need satisfaction, they're pretty similar. So how are you going to satisfy the need? Well, you're hungry. How about eat some McDonald's, right? That's how I'm going to satisfy your need, is by you're going to go out and buy McDonald's, which is how you're going to satisfy it. I'm not even going to buy it for you. You're going to get it yourself. Visualization. You know how great it is going to be, like this delicious, juicy hamburger, all those fries, McDonald's fries, dip them in some ranch and eat them. Look how much better your life is going to be when you're filled with that delicious McDonald's. Maybe you don't like McDonald's, right? But that's the visualization. How is your life going to be better now that this need is satisfied? And step 5 is action. Go to McDonald's right now, right? You are hungry. You know you're hungry. You want to eat, and McDonald's is delicious. It's right down the street. You should go get it. So call to action, a concrete step for them to do it. So we see infomercials. Call this number right now. Go on this website. Order it now. So that's the action step in terms of Monroe's motivated sequence. So I don't see a lot of students picking Monroe's motivated sequence as a speech. I've assigned it for students before in my public speaking class. It works all right, certainly. But again, more in that advertising space is when you can see it more often. But the problem solution, again, that's the most simple one. for students to kind of get their head around and to work with. Certainly, there's other choices as well that you can choose from. So next here, 11.5, persuasive reasoning and fallacies. So there's inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning reaches conclusions through citation of examples and is most frequently used form of logical reasoning. So we see inductive reasoning very often. So we see observations, you analyze those observations, and you create a theory on how things are connected. So it's usually inductive reasoning is generalized based on observation or examples. Conclusions are often more likely or less likely. So this is probably true, right? So again, trying to be persuasive. Persuasive speech is often, it's not necessarily fact. If it's 100% of fact, you're going to inform them, right? Do an informative speech. But as you're trying to persuade them, you may use, hey, this is likely to be true based on these observations that I've seen. And this is how you should get involved with it. And this is the impact that you can have based on these observation examples. Other people did this, and it created a lot of benefit. Other people stopped texting and driving, and it created a lot of benefit. It created for safer roads. So you should too. So that's kind of that inductive reasoning. Certainly, you can read more about it if you want. This is a long chapter, so I'm going to kind of go quickly through this because, again, I'm just trying to get you the gist of it. And next point here is deductive reasoning. So it derives specifics from what is already known. It's preferred form of reasoning used by ancient rhetoricians like Aristotle to make logical arguments. So they say, oh, you got to be deductive to be logical. So you have an idea, you have observations, and then you have conclusion. So a syllogism is a type of deductive reasoning. So the example here, all presidents have lived in the White House. George Washington was a president. Therefore, George Washington lived in the White House. Well, one of the premises is not true. Not all presidents have lived in the White House. The White House wasn't built when George Washington was alive. So you have the major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. If some of your facts are wrong, then your conclusion is going to be wrong. But again, so in this deductive reasoning, you have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So based on this wider generalized information, here's my specific example, the minor premise, and therefore, or here's the conclusion. If the major premise is true, and this is the minor premise is true, the conclusion has to be true, right? If both those things are true, that's how deductive reasoning works. Certainly, you can read through that if you want to read through that in more detail. But again, I'm just kind of quickly going through these things in terms of making a persuasive speech. You don't necessarily need to memorize every single one of these details. The general idea is you need to find important evidence to support your main points. That's why I want to get some persuasive speaking. Trying to persuade your audience of something, you need evidence that resonates with your audience to support those main points, and in order to convince them to take some sort of action or change their beliefs or get involved in some way. So last type of reasoning here, it says the causal reasoning argues an established relationship between a cause and effect. So again, if you're using that cause and effect pattern, this may be helpful. So when you argue for a particular course of action based on potential positive or negative consequences, you're using some causal reasoning. You're trying to create a cause-effect relationship here. So eating more local will boost the local economy and make you healthier. So again, again, it's that relationship that's involved that you're trying to persuade the audience about. So persuasive strategies, again, these go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome. People have been talking about them for a while. We pull them, we still use them today. We have the ethos, logos, and pathos. So ethos first is credibility. So it's this credibility of the speaker. It can be broken down into more specific competence, trustworthiness, and dynamism. Certainly you can do that. I always tell students, establish your ethos, your credibility, by sharing your connection to the topic. And then second, making sure you're verbally citing those sources. If your sources are credible, you're going to be seen as credible. If you have your personal connection to the topic, that's going to make you credible too. So those are two easy things for beginning speakers to do to help build that ethos, that credibility within the speech. Logos means logic, right? The reasoning, making sure your logic is sound. You're avoiding logical fallacies. You're following, again, using those claim, evidence, and warrant, right? You have appropriate evidence that meets your claim, that those fit together with the warrant. You're using good sources, credible information on the topic. Your information is accurate. This logos-logical appeal, I think, can also, well, I guess more of credibility is pronouncing things correctly, but logic, the logos is also shows you're credible if you know how to pronounce things, that you did your time doing the research, you listened to videos, you looked up how to pronounce things. That can be helpful as well. I have some students who are bilingual. So if they're talking about something like related to Latin America or Mexico or Puerto Rico, wherever it may be, they're going to seem more, um, credible if they say those Spanish words with a Spanish accent. Now, I am white and I speak some Spanish, but I'm not good with accents. So it may seem a little bit weird. Certainly, I've seen white people do Spanish accents as well, and pronouncing things in an authentic way can help with credibility too. But again, I'm getting off track. Logos is logic. So making sure you have logical arguments, your information is accurate. Again, if you're pronouncing things correctly, it can fit with making sure you have good information. If you're mispronouncing things, people may start to question your logos, question whether you have good reasoning or logic behind your argument, even though it may not be related. Certainly, that is a way that people can perceive the situation. And pathos, if we go back again to ancient Greece, to Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle was a little suspicious of the pathos. Plato was more in favor of it and saying, hey, the emotional appeal is going to win the day. Even if you're not a credible person, your arguments aren't logical, but you have that emotional appeal, people are going to go with their emotions, right? So having too much emotional appeal can be suspicious. Sometimes we see politicians too use that emotional appeal. You need to do it because of these emotions, but their arguments don't have logic to them. They're not very credible. But again, stirring their emotions is a good way to get them involved in the speech. There's good ways to ethically do pathos, those emotional appeals. So I recommend ethical emotional appeals. So example of ethical emotional appeals for students, for beginning public speakers, is using examples, using stories to bring the topic to life. So instead of just talking about global hunger, give a specific example related to global hunger. Hey, here's this person. Here's what they do for a living, how they try and provide for their family, and here's where the system isn't working for them. And here's how we can change that system to have better, food connections for them, that food ecosystem. So again, having those specific examples can do an emotional appeal. You may have stories from your own life that can be used as an example that helps with the emotional appeal. But just being able to kind of connect with the audience on that level. It doesn't need to be sad. It can be exciting. You can, whatever emotion you want to work with, happiness, excitement. Hey, you're really excited. This is fun to do. I love getting involved this way. Let's go volunteer together, right? Because that's, because it's great. It's great to be able to have an impact to do this together. Let's go to this concert, right? This musician is the best. It's fun. It's a lively environment. People get so excited and friendly. So that's why, again, so whatever emotions you want to work with, certainly you can stir those emotions with the pathos, with that emotional appeal. So again, you should have credibility. So again, making sure you're citing your sources, um, you know, showing why you're credible to speak on the topic, making sure you show you've done your research. Logos, your arguments are sound, they're logical, they make sense, and pathos, some emotional appeal. This is Aristotle's forms of rhetorical proof, and this is used very commonly in persuasive speaking. It's also used in informative speaking when we're looking at an audience, and it makes sense for how some arguments may resonate with an audience more so than others. You want to make sure you have all three parts of that triangle, right? You don't want to rely on one. Certainly, some people do, but you don't want to do that. You don't want to rely on one. So now this next part talks about dissonance, motivation, and needs. So cognitive dissonance it says when some notes, when played together on a piano, produce a sound that is pleasing to our ears. When dissonant combinations of notes are played, we react by wincing or cringing because it's unpleasant. So cognitive dissonance is when things just don't sound right. So mental discomfort when new information, it can be within your speech, right? That cognitive dissonance with what you're sharing within your speech, or cognitive dissonance with what they already know and believe. Your speech may be very sound. It may have great logos, great logic. You may be credible. You may have the right emotional appeal. But if there's a cognitive dissonance with your audience, they may have mental discomfort in taking in that information. So again, doing a proper audience analysis and seeing where your audience may be at can be very helpful to avoid cognitive dissonance. Right? It's not going to be 100% effective. You can't read your audience's mind. But again, taking your time to think about how do I appeal to this specific audience? How do I take this message to this audience to avoid the cognitive dissonance? It's going to be very helpful in making sure you're prepared for your speech. There's also positive and negative motivation. So when using positive motivation, speakers implicitly or explicitly convey to the audience that listening to their message and following their advice will lead to positive results. So hey, let's do this. It's gonna create some good results. The negative motivation implies that failure to follow the speaker's advice is going to result in negative consequences. If you don't do this, bad things will happen. If you text while driving, you're going to get in a car accident, right? That's negative motivation. You should avoid that car accident by putting your phone away, right? Or so again, that's an example of negative motivation. So maybe positive, maybe negative motivation, but there's some reason why your audience is engaged, whether you explicitly say that or whether you're just implicit about it. You're giving them some motivation to get engaged on the topic. You can also appeal to needs. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Certainly, some people don't always say it's a pyramid and needs to be done in this order, but all these are different types of needs that you can meet for the audience. So at the bottom of the pyramid, what Maslow says is most important is those physiological needs. They need to be met first before anything else can be met. So physiological needs, that's hunger, that's getting sleep, that's being in it, just getting those basic needs, water, thirst, basic needs met is the first layer of the pyramid. Second is about safety. So making sure you feel safe and secure in that environment. You can appeal to those needs for the audience. So again, physiological needs, again, my example earlier on McDonald's, that appeals to the audience's physiological needs of hunger. So safety, you may think about safety needs that your audience may have related to the topic. Social needs, hey, you're going to, you're those communications, those relationships that you have with people. How is this important for us to have a community, for us to be together as a community, to work together and to create a better future for ourselves? And maybe looking at those social needs, self-esteem needs. Again, you're going to be a good person because you do this. You're going to be a bad person if you don't do this. That can be part of the self-esteem needs and self-actualization needs. So again, making sure you feel full as a person. I think this is a little bit theoretical to me. That top of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy. Some people see it as more realistic than others. But again, thinking about that pyramid can be very helpful. So again, you don't necessarily need to appeal to all their needs. Certainly, you wouldn't do that in one speech, but you may think about what needs do my audience have. That's about Monroe's motivated sequence as well. They're looking at the needs, but with any speech, you may think, what needs do my audience have, and how is this meeting those needs? That can be helpful in framing your speech. So this is again talking about the different types of needs. And then here's a sample persuasive speech. I certainly have sample speeches outlines in D12 for my students. This one's a bit long, certainly longer than I asked my students to write a speech. But you can see here about the evidence, about the claims that are being made and how things are structured. So it's structured with different layers, how the conclusion helps bring everything together. So you can see some of the general organization as transitions between the main points. It has a lot of information. It has multiple subpoints for each main point. So this is a bit longer speech that I ask my students to do. But certainly you can read through it if you like this example. So yeah, that's the end of the chapter on persuasive speaking. Thank you for watching. My two students who end up watching this every semester. Thank you for getting to the end of this chapter. A couple chapters left of this textbook. But yeah, persuasive speaking is about getting the audience to change their mind, to call them to action, to get them involved in some way. It really needs to be audience centered because the same persuasive message can be very successful with one audience and fall flat with another. You want to think about their pre-existing knowledge on the topic, their pre-existing attitude and beliefs, and where do you want to take them from where they're at? Where do you want them to go? Right? How far do you want them to change in their viewpoints and their actions, and what's realistic for the amount of time that you have with them? You want to make sure to do research to have a lot of good information that has appropriate evidence to support your claims. You want to make sure there's a warrant that connects that evidence to the claims, and then figure out how to organize all that information. You have all these facts, you have all this good evidence. How are you going to organize it in a way that's appealing to the audience and that they can take away, right? They can take something away from the speech. I always say put a call to action right into the conclusion to get them to say very specifically what you want them to take away. So it's very easy for them to get involved with. Certainly, if there's something they can do right then and there, that's great. You may give them multiple things in the solution stage. If you're doing a problem solution pattern, here's multiple solutions you can get involved with. I think that's helpful as well. But thanks for watching. I tried to go over some parts very briefly, so you may want to go back and read those. But again, I try to cover the main information that I want you to take away from this chapter instead of covering everything in detail, because you can do an entire class just on persuasive speaking. So there's tons of information that I could be sharing about. I think this textbook's a bit, or this chapter is a bit long in terms of all the stuff it covers for an introduction to communication class. But hopefully you found this lecture helpful. Thanks for watching. Feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to help.